In the verses before today's story, the Sadducees had contrived a story about marriage and resurrection. Jesus not only astonished them with his answer, but did so in such a way that the Sadducees had nothing to say in response. After all, Jesus knew the Sadducees did not even believe in the resurrection. Now, in today's story, Jesus is asked, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Jesus' initial words were like music to their ears. Being an example of those who loved the Lord was how the religious leaders liked to think of themselves. But Jesus keeps going and says, and just like loving God is the greatest, so is loving your neighbor as yourself. On these, Jesus says, on these two hang all the law and the prophets. In other words, these two are so entangled until they cannot be separated. Loving God is best displayed when neighbor and self are loved as well. When you begin to think of these as indistinguishable, then you are beginning to experience knowing what it means to love God with all. One commentator expressed it this way, quote, while the first commandment represents the vertical dimension, human-divine relationship, loving God, the second commandment represents the horizontal dimension, the human-to-human relationship. The second builds upon the foundation of the first, but the first manifests itself through the second. End of quote. It's not just loving God. It's not just loving neighbor, but it's loving God with all, and it's manifested best in loving neighbor and self. A great place to begin learning how to love is coming to the conclusion that loving neighbor cannot be predicated upon whether or not the neighbor deserves to be loved. Loving as God loves is a gift. But here I will raise a word of caution. Loving does not mean giving people permission to use, misuse, abuse, and take advantage of you. Remember, love God, love neighbor, and love self. If you realize that a person borrows but never gives back, it is all right to say no to the next request. If you see a person has misused your kindness, it is fine to prayerfully limit what you do for them in the future. Loving God and neighbor has gotten a terrible reputation because it's been done in such harmful ways. Ritual without love is not loving God. And love without honoring God is not loving neighbor. God has given us the ability to discern, to distinguish right from wrong. God has also placed us in a community of people who will pray with us and for us as we seek to live in ways that demonstrate the love of God. Now, what do you believe is occurring as Jesus goes on in this conversation and he asks the Pharisees a question, actually two? Who do you think, or what do you think of the Messiah, and whose son is he? What do you think of the Messiah, and whose son is he? These questions seem odd and out of place in the context of dialogue about the greatest commandment. Or are they out of place? Please consider the following. Just as the Pharisees assumed that loving God was the greatest commandment, and those who are known for loving God were likewise the greatest, there is also this assumption. The assumption, not only do we have God and we honor loving God and we figured it all out, they assumed, we also have figured it all out about Messiah. The Messiah is the son of David. The greatest commandment is loving God. We got this taken care of. But let us listen to Jesus. The greatest commandment is loving God with all and your neighbor as yourself. The Messiah is called Lord by David. How can the Messiah be considered Lord by David and be David's son? The answer? Pharisees, just as you think loving God is all there is to life, so likewise you mistakenly think that the Messiah can be recognized by you because the Messiah will be David's son? No. Basically, the Pharisees were learning that they would not recognize the Messiah because, like the love of God, recognition comes as God reveals. Loving God with all has little to do with ritual and much to do with relationships. Recognizing Messiah has little to do with monarchy and biology and much to do with revelation. Revelation that is known by God's will for you. They may not have recognized what Jesus was really saying. Is that your only criteria for recognizing Messiah, that he be David's son? Behold, David's son stands before you, yet you do not recognize him. So how do these verses tie together? What are we to glean from these words? Learning to live into loving God and loving neighbor is a lifelong endeavor. We learn that we must love and spend the rest of our lives learning how. Jesus said the law and prophets hang on to commandments. In other words, learning how to love. Many of us know what to do, but knowledge or awareness does not automatically translate into actions. After many years of living, I am convinced that this learning to love path is not based on feelings. Just as I learned to play clarinet as a child, no matter how horribly I played initially, and I learned to read no matter how I mispronounced words, and I learned to speak no matter how my points were clear or unclear from one moment to the next. So we are called to be faithful in our learning. We must be faithful as we strive to learn to love God with all our heart. We must be faithful as we learn to love neighbor as ourselves. And we cannot wait until we feel like it. Sometimes I do not want to be bothered, but I still must reach out, listen, learn, grow, pray, even when I do not feel like it. If you are waiting to feel like it, I'm afraid you will never move forward. God walks with us and gives us strength and courage when we least feel like it. God can give the grace to see you through those seasons when you really want to walk out, but know that you need to stay. We serve a God who loves us, and we serve a God who knows us. And God is faithful to us even when we are not faithful to God. We make a mistake if we conclude feelings are the basis of our actions. Sometimes we just simply must learn obedience and trust that the same God who walked the Galilean shores and touched and changed lives is the same resurrected God who comes to us in grace. Don't be weary in doing well. In due season, you will reap if you faint not. Learn to love, and the God of love will be with you. Amen.